This is the Wartime Broadcasting Service. This country has been attacked with nuclear weapons. Communications have been severely disrupted, and the number of casualties and the extent of the damage are not yet known. We shall bring you further information as soon as possible. Meanwhile, stay tuned to this wavelength, stay calm, and stay in your own homes. Remember, there is nothing to be gained by trying to get away. By leaving your homes, you could be exposing yourselves to greater danger. This is part of the official BBC broadcast you would have heard if a nuclear attack had occurred in the United Kingdom during the Cold War. The broadcast would have gone on to explain that you should ration water, have a food supply of at least 14 days, and would recommend that you stay in your home until the all clear is given. Of course, while British civilians would have had to make do with their own shelter arrangements, government officials would have headed to their nearest designated underground bunker. The Prime Minister would likely have been whisked away to the cutting-edge Kelvedon hatch in the borough of Brentwood in Essex County. Although today this bunker is nothing more than a Cold War tourist attraction, at the time, Kelvedon Hatch was the regional government headquarters, or RGHQ, essentially acting as the center of all wartime efforts after the attack. This means that had the bunker not withstood nuclear war and had the inhabitants not survived, the UK would have been in chaos, perhaps even collapsing entirely. So just how durable was a fallout shelter built in the 50s, and would it really have survived an all-out attack from Soviet powers? From information overload to an oversimplification of complex engineering, actually keeping up with the latest innovation in the news can be difficult sometimes, which is why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Ground News. If you don't already know them, Ground News is the brainchild of a former NASA engineer who developed an app and website meant to make understanding anything from the latest in AI to the latest in wars much easier. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. I follow my favorite topics on here, like innovation and artificial intelligence, and found this story on how the US is racing against China to develop AI-powered and GPS-free fighter jets. The story overview is based on nearly 150 articles Ground News found covering it, with quick summaries up top, a breakdown of how many left, center, and right-leaning news sources there are, and even how credible their reporting is. And over on the left, you can compare how each source is reporting on this. Seeing all the ways technology shapes our world and our future is really exciting to think about, which is why I trust data-driven platforms like Ground News to keep up with all of the developments. I highly recommend you check them out too by going to ground.news/megaprojects or scanning the QR code on the screen now. You guys will get 40% off the same unlimited access Vantage plan that I use, and I think it's really worth it. Plus, they're non-partisan and independent, so they are as objective as it's possible to be. And now back to today's video. Even over half a century later, Kelvedon Hatch is still one of the safest places you could be if the bombs ever did start falling. The bunker may even seem somewhat familiar if you've watched the Fallout series or played any of the Fallout games, with the interior having a somewhat similar appearance to vaults. The vaults of the Fallout franchise are naturally entirely fictional, but the game designers clearly took inspiration from existing Cold War bunkers such as this. The hatch was, and probably still is, capable of resisting just about anything, including a nuclear detonation in the near vicinity, and probably even a detonation directly overhead. For context, according to a recently uncovered account from Elzo Nomura, he survived being within 200 meters of the Hiroshima blast epicenter because he happened to be in a reinforced cement basement of the Fuel Rationing Control Union. If that's the capability of a basement, Kelvedon Hatch would be many times more durable. The hatch's cement and tungsten structure is 38 meters below ground, is capable of housing up to 600 essential personnel for a period of up to 3 months, and would likely have been where the Prime Minister was sent in a time of crisis. Inside, the Prime Minister and essential staff would have enjoyed relative luxury, having a dedicated sewer treatment facility, air conditioning, a self-sustaining borehole water supply, as well as a full array of telecommunications equipment. Direct access to a number of military networks was provided via MOLD, a VHF radio system that would have allowed direct communications between the regular army, TA battalions, and regional headquarters, as well as via Conrad, a simple printed messaging service able to quickly send and receive printable information. Importantly, none of these systems relied on existing landline infrastructure, and so would still have been operational even after other forms of communication were devastated. Kelvedon Hatch is a military-grade R4 Sector Operations Control (SOC) structure, with R1 through 3 bunkers being smaller and less elaborate. Primarily, R4 bunkers are 3 stories and include expanded living spaces, with the idea being that a significant number of people could be housed there on a semi-permanent basis. Interestingly, R4 bunkers weren't necessarily intended as fallout shelters when they were originally constructed, though this particular one did come to serve that purpose after a few modifications. And we'll get into the bunker's original purpose as part of the Rotor early warning system a little bit later on. In terms of construction, R4 bunkers are about as simple as you could ask for, based on the Cold War era military philosophy of focusing on blunt practicality above all else. Though being simple in design certainly doesn't mean that the bunkers weren't incredibly effective. The first step of construction involved excavating an enormous hole, then laying down a shock-absorbing gravel foundation. The 3-story bunker was erected on top of that foundation, with the goal being to keep the entirety of the structure below ground level. Each bunker wall is 10-foot thick reinforced concrete with tungsten rods every 6 inches, tungsten being the chosen metal due to having the highest possible melting temperature. Around the concrete core is an additional simple wire mesh cocoon. The mesh acts as an EMP-resistant Faraday cage, thus protecting against electromagnetic pulses that would otherwise damage the interior electronic equipment. The final layers are simple brick and pitch waterproofing, after which the excavated earth was used to create an artificial earthen hill over the bunker. Once completed, as simple as it all is, the bunker is a virtually impenetrable shelter. However, if you are an astute bunker expert, you're probably aware that there must be some chinks in the armor, at least as far as for allowing for the exchange of fresh air. The solution for the air intake at Kelvedon Hatch is an entirely separate side shaft that plays a double role as an emergency exit and an air exchange system. The shaft runs the vertical length of the shelter from the surface to the bottom, carefully integrated so that no air can pass into the shelter without first being processed through a filtration system. The filtration room, housed adjacent to the bunker at the bottom floor, is also where a sewage pump handles the interior plumbing. As said earlier, the bunker is also directly linked to a sustainable borehole system, meaning that fresh water is available almost indefinitely, or likely for multiple years at the very least. Thus, inhabitants need not have exited for any reason so long as food and fuel supplies held out. It's an impressively durable, self-contained system, though it can only be guessed at how long inhabitants could have held out, given that Kelvedon Hatch was obviously never actually used as a shelter. As far as gaining access to the bunker is concerned, this is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the end result. With the earthen hill in place and nature gradually integrating all signs of construction back into the countryside, there is virtually no evidence of the vast bunker that sits beneath your feet. The only telltale sign is the radio tower, a 150-foot tall protrusion that facilitates communications. Though even the tower isn't a dead giveaway, given that it's strategically located some distance away. The entrance is hidden below a quaint, unimposing bungalow, not unlike hundreds of others scattered across the English countryside. At a glance, the bungalow is nothing more than a simple 1-story home, but step inside and you'll find a blast-absorbing L-shaped 91-meter tunnel that terminates at a massive set of blast doors. Once those doors had closed, nothing would have got in, including the majority of standard explosive weapons available at the time. During World War II, the Royal Air Force, RAF, relied on the Chain Home early warning radar system. Chain Home was constructed before and during the war, consisting of a combination of Air Ministry experimental stations, AIM stations, including Type 1 and Type 2 radars, with the later addition of improved Type 7 radars. The towers were stationed on the coasts and collectively were capable of detecting incoming aircrafts at a range of about 160 kilometers with varying degrees of accuracy depending on the era of Chain Home's life. The revolutionary system allowed the RAF to quickly and efficiently respond to any sign of incoming Luftwaffe German Air Force planes, essentially providing the UK with an enormous advantage in many key battles. By the end of the war, 40 Chain Home stations were in use, though as Luftwaffe attacks became less and less of a threat, the system was repurposed for the detection of V-2 rocket launches. But World War II came to an end, and the 50s ushered in a new era of dangers, the most prominent being the threat of Soviet bombers. This made the 50s a decade characterized by the UK making a scramble to quickly update their early warning radar network, hopefully before a better system was necessary. A big part of the United Kingdom Warning and Monitoring Organization project, UKWMO, was referred to as Rotor, and the key new technology was codenamed Green Garlic. Green Garlic leveraged a new type of radar that utilized microwave frequencies, the effect of which was to make radar that was dramatically better than anything previously seen. With the new radars, detection range instantly went from a mere 160 kilometers to a massive 390. This revolutionized UK WMO overnight. The new radars, Ames Type 80s, were built to be put into use as quickly as possible, replacing the Ames Type 1, 2, and 7 chain home system over the course of a few years. The race to transition chain home into Rotor began in the early 50s, with the original plan ambitiously intending on constructing a total of 66 new radar stations. The combined network would provide full coverage of all of the United Kingdom, thereby introducing the best early warning system the country had ever seen. As part of Rotor, the construction of multiple blast-resistant bunkers began, including multiple small R1 and 2 bunkers, as well as a handful of bigger R4 bunkers, such as the one that we're talking about today at Kelvedon Hatch. But things didn't exactly go as planned. As new technology became available and as the nature of warfare evolved, the Rotor radar system became not only less necessary, but largely obsolete before it was even finished, at least in the initial form that it was intended. The Carcinotron radar jammer came about in the mid-1950s and was the first serious blow to the system. It turned out that a single aircraft carrying such a jammer could, in one fell swoop, render all Rotor radar systems useless. Furthermore, the hydrogen bomb and ballistic missiles also changed the game, ushering in a new era of warfare that benefited little from having full radar coverage of an entire country. So just as quickly as the R-type bunkers were built, many became irrelevant. Most were sold off, others were repurposed, with the R4 bunker in Essex County transitioning from a sector operations control into a regional seat of government, or RSG, and finally into a regional government headquarters, or RGHQ. Kelvedon Hatch was maintained as an RGHQ until the early 90s at a cost of around £3 million a year. Finally, at the point that the risk of nuclear war was no longer seen as credible, the land and the R4 bunker were sold back to the original owners of the land, the Parish family. Today, Kelvedon Hatch is a popular Cold War tourist attraction, seeing around 60,000 visitors a year. The owning Parish family is happy to welcome in guests, provide them with a tour, and to let children enjoy the various obstacle courses and other outdoor activities. As perhaps a rather cutting and ironic joke, the company that handles the outdoor activities is called Nuclear Races. Now, given the current political climate, you may be wondering if you could get access to such a bunker should nuclear war once again become a realistic possibility. The good news is that the current owner, Mike Parish, is willing to cut you a deal, but only if you're willing to fork out £500,000 to cover your long-term stay. He's jokingly stated that he'd consider accepting such an offer if the Beckhams were to pitch up, so he clearly doesn't believe the nuclear war is happening anytime soon. Less jokingly, he's confident that everything inside the bunker still works as intended, would still offer effective communication in case of disaster, and adds that the bunker is actually far better equipped for modern nuclear war than you might think. He stresses that none of the antique equipment relies on modern cell towers or other fragile infrastructure, meaning that it will keep working in virtually any worst-case scenario. On the other hand, you'll probably have a bidding war on your hands long before you get anywhere near the bunker. Parish explains that interest in renting his bunker spiked after the 9/11 attacks, with wealthy locals insisting they're ready to pay any sum to rent out the bunker. Those offers eventually died down, only to pick up again in recent months. The Ukraine war has again sparked paranoid interest in bunkers, and Parish has again had to deal with dozens of calls from wealthy locals. He's turned them all down, though he still maintains that he'd consider an offer from the Beckhams. Because why not? With all of that said, would you even have to engage in a bidding war against the Beckhams for a place in a bunker? The UK is surely much better equipped today to handle a nuclear attack than it was in the 50s. Right? Well, Switzerland has nearly 400,000 bunkers available, including 9,000 public ones, enough to house virtually everyone in the country. But the entire rest of the world has basically no infrastructure in place. The vast majority of the UK's once elaborate series of fallout bunkers have been almost entirely sold off. Simply put, they weren't needed and were costing the government a fortune, and so have passed on to become farms, museums, cannabis factories, wine cellars, and other such things. As recently as 2015, one bunker was converted into a 5-bedroom eco-home and put on the market for £700,000. Another in 2022 was sold for £250,000, with there being no word on what it will be used for. The reality is that these days in the UK, there are just a few dozen active bunkers, barely enough to house essential government personnel, and certainly nowhere near enough to think about offering space to the average citizen. The majority of all Cold War preparations have long since been scrapped, meaning that currently the country is almost entirely unprepared for a nuclear war. In fact, according to experts, the plans in case of a leakage at a power station are much more clearly thought out, with any plans for nuclear war just coming a distant second. To put it another way, were there to be nuclear war today, the most you'd probably get is an SMS giving about a 20-minute warning at best. There are definite plans in place for the Prime Minister, the royal family, and other essential personnel, of course, with a new Defence Crisis Management Centre located below the Ministry of Defence building. Now, as a heads up, much of the information to follow is based on rumor and speculation. Details on emergency plans for government officials in the UK are not open to the public for obvious reasons. The bunker said to be located below the Ministry of Defense building, codenamed Pindar after the ancient Greek poet whose house remained standing after all others were destroyed, is much more elaborate and dramatically more expansive than anything at Kelvedon Hatch. It's rumored that the bunker is connected to a much broader series of below-ground military facilities, as well as to Buckingham Palace, including many hundreds of hidden tunnels crisscrossing below the UK. There are allegedly other hidden entrances at various locations, though these are a well-kept secret and you aren't likely to stumble across them by accident. As far as the most essential British individuals are concerned, a number of alleged protocols have been put in place to keep the King and Prime Minister alive at all costs, namely Operation Candid that came about during the Cold War and Python that was supposedly hashed out in more detail during the hottest moments of the Brexit debacle. At their core, the protocols aim to secure the monarch and Prime Minister separately, given the key role each plays in a functional British government. Which is to say, the loss of one might be endured, but both would be pretty devastating. It's also been speculated that the broader royal family would be split up at different locations in order to protect succession lines and ensure that at least one royal survived in a worst-case scenario. The alleged Python, in more detail, is rumored to involve multiple cells being established around the country, each having its own royal and minister of state. Thus, should any single cell be wiped out, the country may still continue on. With all that being said, let's just be upfront. Some say that the world is closer to nuclear war than it's been since the 70s, and that may be true relatively speaking. But the mutually assured destruction policy is still in place, and if you believe that this policy safeguarded against nuclear war previously, you'll be confident that it's still effective today. It is naturally impossible to ever say that the threat of nuclear war is zero, but then the same is true for asteroid impacts, invasion from aliens, and any number of other potential disasters.